Hello everyone, and our online audience and our local audience. Welcome to this afternoon's real seminar. It is my great pleasure to introduce a very important person to this afternoon, Donna Lewis. Donna's been a stalwart of natural resource management research in Northern Territory the last 20 plus years, I'd reckon. Don't do the numbers, not pretty. Donna has extensive experience in the vegetation and systems of North Australia, and we're fortunate to have her now part of the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network at our little enclave that's an outpost here at Charles Darwin Uni. I'm a proud member of that enclave in the Ecosystem Processes facility, I believe it's called. Today, Donna's going to update us on the TERN's ecosystem surveillance program. It all sounds a bit big brotherish, I must say, but that just means it's a sort of a word that just tells us about what our ecosystems are and are not doing with climate change and land use change across Australia. So without much further ado, I'm going to hand over to Donna, and she's going to give us an update on her new role with TERN in North Australia. Thanks, Donna. Clip that one on. We'll be in business.
Thanks, Lindsay. Can everyone hear me okay with it down here, or do I have to hold it? Fantastic. So I'm wearing two hats today. So I've only just commenced with TERN, with the ecosystem surveillance program. But I'm first of all presenting on plot-based vegetation classification in the Northern Territory. So this is something that I presented at ESA in Launceston when we could travel and attend conferences. So I believe ESA is in Darwin, well, was meant to be in Darwin this year, and there is a symposium on vegetation classification that I'll be chairing. So keep an eye out for that one. So I'm wearing my Northern Territory government hat for this component of my presentation. But I just wanted to let you know that this presentation has already been published in the Australian Journal of Botany. So an overview of plot-based data in the NT. And how it aligns with the National Classification System. There is a special issue coming out very soon, like within the next month. And in that issue, there are a number of publications using Northern Territory vegetation plot data. And we've actually aligned and published two vegetation types in the NT with the International Vegetation Classification System, which is fantastic. So eucalyptus tetradonta woodlands and hummock grasslands as well. So now it's been placed, those systems have been placed into an international context. That's something I'd really like to work more towards, is placing and classifying Australian vegetation into an international system. There's a couple of other publications in this journal as well. And one of them is comparing data subsets and transformations for using that data for vegetation mapping. And also looking at species richness. Can we use vegetation data as a surrogate for species richness? And we've got 4 case studies in the NT. So keep an eye out for those. So the agenda of my presentation today is an overview of site-based vegetation data in the NT and classification systems and implementing the national guidelines. And you might have all heard about the National Vegetation Information System. Is our site-based data compatible with this classification system? And how does it conform with the international classification system? Everyone might be really interested to know, how do we access this data? So I'll touch on that. And what are the current initiatives that the NTG is currently working on in this space? And then I'll provide a brief introduction to the TERN Ecosystem Surveillance Program, which I've just commenced in that role. So I'm really excited to be, I'll eventually be based here at the university. I'm not sure what room yet, but I believe it's in the yellow building. So probably towards the end of October. So an overview of site-based vegetation data in the NT. It all started back in the 1950s. So this was part of the CSIRO land research series when they were conducting integrated surveys, so land systems, land unit mapping, to look at agricultural potential in the Northern Territory. And it's still happening to this day, developing the north. In the 1980s, we did have a corporate system called Dakota, to store vegetation data. Some old data sets are still in this system that are really hard to extract, as you can imagine. The first vegetation map for the Northern Territory occurred in the 90s, and this was based on just over 2,000 plots, which isn't many plots to map the entire Northern Territory at 1 to 1 million. We still don't have a seamless vegetation map at a finer spatial scale, unfortunately. We built an Oracle site database, and this was just for the integrated surveys at that point in time. We did an inventory of 30,000 sites, but only 66% of those sites were digital. Everything was still on paper. We adopted the National Vegetation Information System framework and developed some guidelines for the NT back in 2007, which I was heavily involved with. And then we developed, or we revised the RABS database to become the corporate Northern Territory Government plot database. So now we've got one system in the NT. Further audits were conducted and we assessed 43,000 sites. Since that time, we've been incorporating more and more legacy plot data into this system, and that's continuing to this day. So when we look at the collection of site-based vegetation data by decade, the big decades were the 90s and the 2000s. So the 1990s was when the NT VegMap was produced, and Jeremy Russell Smith's rainforest survey as well. That was quite a big venture. So where are we today? So we do have a corporate system. There's various data custodians, so including consultants and many divisions of the Northern Territory Government. Currently there's over 400 surveys, 56,000 plots, so they're bounded plots, and we do incorporate threatened species point source records, and we're doing that more and more. There's about 885,000 Flora records, and I'll show you later where we can access that data. Now, the taxonomy is linked to the Australian Plant Census, so the taxonomy is up to date using current names, and that was a project that we did a few years ago to make sure that our data is current and following the Australian Plant Census. Some survey data is still incomplete. The Department of Environment, Parks and Water Security, data is stored in other systems as well. So the rangeland monitoring plots, that's stored in a separate system. The weeds data is stored in a separate system as well, but that's all accessible on NR maps. So some data is non-compliant. We're always trying to work towards ways of making and standardising our data collection, and so it can be used for a number of purposes. So we develop these data management plans for anyone going out collecting any vegetation related data and other ecological attributes, that they put together a data management plan to make sure it conforms. So what are the survey purposes in this corporate system that we call it VSD, the vegetation site database? So the majority of it's been for mapping, so pure veg mapping, integrated surveys, so land unit, land systems mapping. Another component is for biodiversity surveys, so habitat recognition for fauna surveys. Floristic inventory, this data has mainly been information that the herbariums collected over the years in association with collecting herbarium specimens. More recently, we do collect a lot of information on rare and threatened species. There's some weed inventory data in there. We are collecting more information for development assessment purposes, monitoring. I think the monitoring side of things will increase. And then 18% of legacy data, that's already been bulk uploaded into this system, which is fantastic. So we've made a lot of progress in the last decade at corporatising all of our plot data. So when we look at the distribution of the data in the Northern Territory, you can see a lot of it's on road networks, mainly in the arid zone. There's huge gaps in the arid zone, and a lot of the data has been collected across the top end. There's a lot of legacy data sets that still hasn't been uploaded from the arid zone. We have been working towards that. So now I'm going to run through an overview of vegetation classification and national guidelines in the NT. So we've used a number of classification systems over the years. Originally we used a modified Carnahan spec. I'm assuming people might have heard of those systems. And that's been mainly for vegetation mapping. And then there's the Braun Blanquet, which is predefined classes using cover abundance scores. And more recently, this is the classification system that we followed, the Walker and Hopkins, which is known as the Yellow Book. And we adopted the NVIS framework back in 2007. So when we talk about numerical analysis, how do we analyse plot-based data? So the only territory-wide classification was the NT 1 to a million veg map, and it used an altered spec system using the tallest stratum with cover more than 5%. Now, pure veg mapping to this day is still quite ad hoc, it's not systematic, and we use a combination of numerical and intuitive analysis. One of the papers in the special issue touches on a methodology for veg mapping and using numerical techniques. Integrated surveys, which is your land unit land systems, that's purely intuitive. We don't really use any numerical classification. So there's no standard method in the NT. So just looking at the national classification, these are the books that I was referring to. So the Yellow Book, the Blue Book, and then the NVIS attribute manual. So that's the classification system that we follow. The Yellow Book, just as an FYI, is the vegetation chapter is being revised. So TERN is actually facilitating that. So I'll be heavily involved in doing that revision of the vegetation chapter. I can keep you all updated as things progress in that space. So what we did back in 2007, we actually came up with some guidelines for the NT. Now these are being revised as well. That was one of my last jobs before I started this one, was to provide a bit of a draft. So hopefully someone will progress that while I'm not in that position. And as part of that, we came up with a set of core attributes that should be collected in the field. So the site-based data, and then the polygon data, we had a set of core attributes too that follow the NVIS classification system. We ran a series of workshops in Alice Springs and Darwin, hoping that people would adopt these standards. So we're all collecting data in a similar way. And these are our corporate data systems when it comes to plot data and then mapping data. So how compatible is the NT site-based vegetation data with the NVIS hierarchy? So there was a number of sites that could not be classified using NVIS. So with NVIS, there's a hierarchy that's 6 levels. So the highest level, level 1, is growth form. What's the dominant growth form of that vegetation community? Level 2 is the structural formation. So there's no floristics, it's just purely structural attributes, height, cover, and growth form. So whether it's a low open woodland or a mid-high tussock grassland. Level 3 is where you start bringing in some floristics. So it's a broad floristic formation. So what's the dominant genus? So it's a eucalyptus low open woodland, for example. Level 4 is where you start bringing in strata. So the 3 dominant strata with tree, and then your shrub layer, and then your ground layer, and the dominant genera for those as well. Level 5 and 6 is where you start bringing in the full floristics. So what are the 3 dominant species for level 5 in the 3 dominant strata? Level 6 takes it another level of detail again, up to 5 dominant species per strata and substrata. So if you've got 2 shrub layers, then that'll come into your level 6. So when we look at this on a map, so fortunately 20% of the data is level 5, so that's not too bad. You've got all the legacy data here that just couldn't be classified because it didn't have all the right attributes, it didn't have any structural information, it might have been just a species list, or for level 2 here it might have just been the structural elements. So that's the extent and distribution of the data that couldn't be classified to an NVIS level. NVIS level 1, so this is where it's just the dominant growth form. So this might have just been a dominant species list, and all you could do was say, okay, the dominant growth form's a tree. And then level 2, structural formation. These were mainly associated with fauna surveys, where they were just interested in knowing what the structure of the vegetation was and weren't really interested in the floristics. Level 3, there's a few more dots on the map for that one, which is good, so more data is being collected. Level 4 and 5, I had to combine those, but you can see that there's quite a reasonable distribution of plots in the NT for that. So that's where we've got like dominant species, we've got structural information, we've got what the dominant growth form is. And then level 6, you can see that these are actually the surveys that have been more recently collected since 2007, when we adopted the standards. We're doing full floristic inventories and you had more detail collected at a plot. And that's what we're aiming for, is a level 6. And then combined, that's the spatial coverage. Still a lot of gaps. The territory is a big place. So how does it conform with the international classification? I've been fortunate enough to work with some colleagues from the States actually, that have been working on the international classification system. And rather than using map data sets, they actually use plot data to classify the vegetation. So it doesn't have any sort of limitations. And that's what I'd like to try and do in the NT eventually. So the IVC, it takes into consideration natural and cultural vegetation stands, not just natural. So it's distinct from vegetation mapping. It has 8 hierarchical levels. So the 6th broadens too fine. So it takes into consideration the climate, the substrate, geology, hydrology, disturbance, and then the floristic structure and life form at the finer levels of detail. In the NT, we've got a classification system for natural vegetation, but not really modified landscapes. It's largely driven by vegetation mapping, and there's 6 levels, as you saw before, the vegetation hierarchy, and it takes into consideration the floristics, the structure, and the life form. So the height classes, the cover classes, what the dominant growth form is, and then what the species are. So can we retrofit our data to the IVC using derived products? We probably could, but it would take a little bit of work. But I think it requires an Australian-wide approach to do that. So where can we access all of this data? There's a lot there that could be used for your research. It's available via NR Maps. Anyone's available? I'm assuming people have heard or used NR Maps. So you can download information from the Flora Atlas. So they're basically observations, so species, point source records. And just recently, before I left, I managed to get the vegetation sites up there. So the maps that you saw previously, all of that data is now on NR Maps. You can go straight to the Flora Atlas FTP site. We deliver our data via a Darwin Core archive every 6 months to the Atlas of Living Australia as well. So it's reasonably up to date. The Flora NT website, you can actually view the blue dots are the VSD sites. The green dots are the herbarium specimens. So this was developed mainly for herbarium records, but then we thought, you know what, to make it more complete on a distribution map for a species, let's bring in the VSD sites as well. So you can see that the distribution fits quite well with the herbarium specimens and the VSD sites too. So you can view them, but you can't download them from Flora NT. So in the Oracle system, we do have an external link. So if someone's wanting to use the system, an administrator can give you access directly to Oracle. And then you can also submit a digital data request. So our current initiatives are to revise the guidelines, which I prepared a very rough draft before I left. Might still be sitting there in a couple of years. And this one is more advanced. NT guidelines for rare and threatened species survey. this one's very close to being publicly available. And then we've got another one on protocols for collecting and vouchering herbarium specimens as well. So watch that space. So we have a new layer in our maps. So if you go to vegetation and then vegetation sites, you'll have to zoom right in to be able to display the plots, but you can do a data extract anywhere on the map. And the list will come up like this. It's basically a data discovery tool. So what we've done is we've been able to concatenate the dominant species in each strata. There's landform information, there's disturbance information. It'll have a link to if there's a soil site, you can download site photos as well. So you can, which I find a really valuable tool, is to be able to have a visual of what that vegetation type is. And then it's got the structural formation, the NVIS code. So yeah, feel free to have a play around with that. I meant to bring some pamphlets today, but I can bring in some NR Maps pamphlets when I am physically here in the office. Still working on bulk uploading legacy data sets to VSD. Our VSD data model does conform with something that TERN's been working on. And it's another section of TERN based out of University of Queensland. It conforms with the information model and data exchange protocol for plot-based data. So they're developing Ecoplots. It's not yet publicly available. They've got a demonstration site, but all of the TERN ecosystem surveillance records will be available here. They've also got data from Queensland, so the core veg data, some of the New South Wales plot data, some of the biological surveys from South Australia. So we're hoping that this Ecoplots will become the Australian plot-based repository where people can access data from across the nation, which will be fantastic because currently we can't do it. We're still refining apps for field data collection. We'd also like to implement the 3 guidelines. So as you know, ESA was meant to be in Darwin in November. It's a shame that it has to go online, but just letting you know that there is a symposium on vegetation classification, and we're hoping we've actually applied to establish an affiliated group in regards to vegetation classification as part of ESA. So if anyone's interested in becoming a member of that group, more than welcome to, but I can share details when that's all happened. During that symposium, I will be presenting a reanalysis of all the NT plot data and trying to come up with like a very high level typology for the Northern Territory, and just looking at ways that can potentially align with the IVC, but at the higher levels. So there'll be other presentations that are using NT plot data as well in that symposium. So just thought I'd give ESA a bit of a plug there. Is anyone else presenting at ESA? Yep, oh, fantastic, great. So that's my segue into my new role with TERN. When I was approached about this position, it was going to be based in Adelaide, and I wasn't prepared to move to Adelaide. And then TERN were in touch again, and they said, look, I think we might be able to base you remotely in Darwin. So they thought it might be a really good opportunity to get some, more exposure. Lindsay's up here and wears a TERN hat, and now having another person to wear a TERN hat in another one of their programs would be a really good thing. So my title is Curation Lead. So I'll be working with the ecosystem surveillance team. So basically it's the on-ground monitoring plots. They're 100 by 100 metre plots, a series of point intercept transects, collection of herbarium specimens, DNA samples, soil bulk density, and they're looking at a whole range of other modules as well. So I'll be responsible for sort of leading the curation of the physical collection and digital collection. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes when the physical collection is down in Adelaide and I'm in Darwin. But certainly the digital collection, they're building a whole new facility down there at Wake campus. So I'll be going down there in a couple of weeks to look at how they're storing their samples. So my previous role was with the Northern Territory Herbarium. I'll have some insight about their collection management protocols and how they should be setting up that facility. I'll be responsible for sort of running the field program or coordinating the field program up here in Northern Australia. So hopefully there'll be some revisits to some of our monitoring plots in the Gulf next year. And I'll also be promoting the TERN ecosystem surveillance in Northern Australia. So quite ironic that this photo was taken back in Launceston at ESA in 2019. Little did I know that I'd be working with Ben Sparrow in the middle, who's the program lead, and Emrys, who's the senior botanist, and the three of us will be working quite closely together. They both did quite a big stint with the Northern Territory government in Alice Springs, so I have known them for quite a number of years. And building collaborations and partnerships, so exactly what we're doing right now. So this just shows a bit of a distribution of the monitoring plot network for the ecosystem surveillance plots, also known as Ozplots. I don't think those figures there are quite correct. I think there's more likely over 800 plots now, and they've done quite a few site visits. They've done a lot of revisits in New South Wales and Victoria after the bushfire events. And then, as I said, they'll be doing some revisits up here in the Northern Territory, the top end, next year. So it's collecting survey plot data, so monitoring. Within their plots, they do a soil pit to a certain depth. They collect bulk density samples. They collect voucher specimens. Sorry, I took this slide from someone else. So, and then the point intercept method, they have quite a number of transects, and they have like a photo point as well. So they have some really, really good panoramic photos of all of their sites. So yeah, lots of flora related information. So individual specimens, the stratum. So when I talked about the stratum concept before, you know, cover, height, what are the dominant species? So we characterise what that vegetation community is. Lots of landscape related features as well, including landform. They've always looked at having a fauna module, but they've never actually got it up and running. I think they're developing a fauna module at the moment, just a methodology, as well as a number of other modules. They're all in draft, but I'm sure in the next sort of 12 months they will become available. Lindsay might have already seen this slide, but this shows the distribution of sites. So Lindsay's working ecological processes, so the Ozflux, and this is the group that I'm working in here, and then the landscapes is more the remote. Yeah. And it might be more of the remote sensing side of things too. Yeah. Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah, yes. Yeah, I think Stuart Finn from UQ was quite involved in that.
Yeah, Stuart Finn leads it from UQ, but that's essentially the remote sensing.
Yeah.
Program.
So Ben Sparrow, who's the program lead for the ecosystem surveillance program, is hoping to come up early next year. So I'm guessing it might be February sometime, and he is very keen to do a presentation about the whole TERN program, but he'll be going into a lot more detail about the ecosystem surveillance side of things. He's also presenting at ESA in the same symposium as me. Yep. So if you're already registered, make sure you watch Ben's presentation as well. So the data is accessible. So the data discovery portal, so the ecosystem surveillance monitoring plot data is here. There's also an Ozplots R package where you can access the data there. So once I've been in the role for a lot longer, I'll be able to answer more questions. But as I've only just started, I'm still getting my head around a lot of things. So if you do have any burning questions, you've got Lindsay over there. I'm just dropping you in, Lindsay. Or you can contact Ben Sparrow, who's the program lead. TERN. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much, everyone. If you've got any questions.
Thanks, Donna. Who's got a burning question?
I have a question.
Okay.
Just at the very beginning, you spoke about intuitive surveys. I know it's probably
Classification?
Yeah, classification.
Yep.
What is that?
Okay, so intuitive, when we talk about numerical classification, we've basically used all of the quantitative data and run it through some sort of multivariate analysis. And there's quite a number of packages for that. You know, you can do it in R. There's a vegan package. There's the good old pattern that we used years ago that still works really, really well, especially for large data sets, Primer. So we do a multivariate analysis, a cluster analysis to come up with our floristic groups. And that's how we work out what the vegetation communities are based on that plot data. And then we assign it to the polygons derived for a vegetation map. The intuitive technique is not using that numerical data. So, for example, I know there's a number of people that prefer to use that intuitive technique where they'll just, you know, look at what the plots are and just lump those into the same site without doing any numerical analysis. But then I think the better approach is to do a combination of the two. So that publication at the beginning, so if I open that there, so this publication here, comparing data subsets and transformations for reproducing an expert-based classification, that's where I look at numerical classification, intuitive classification, then a combination of the two, because you can come up with these numerical-based vegetation communities, but then sometimes they might not be mappable. So if you're looking at a satellite image, like, well, this, I know that this is this community here, but you can't see the pattern on the map. So you use your expert knowledge to lump that community with something else that it's closely aligned to. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's using expert opinion. So that's basically what intuitive means.
Okay.
In this instance. What's that?
There is.
Oh dear. Oh my goodness. Okay. There are people. Sorry, everyone. That's.
I've got it. Maybe go scroll up a little bit.
Oh, that's Alison. Hi, Alison. We're just reading. Oh, okay.
Oh yeah, Alison's just shared it.
Oh, thanks, thanks, Alison. Oh, you're a gem.
Thanks for your chat, Donna. It was awesome. Presentation was great. I just had a quick question about why do you think it's important that the vegetation is classified to an international standard in Australia rather than all of the vegetation being classified in Australia to an Australian standard? Yeah.
Okay, yes. So I'm putting my herbarium taxonomic hat on here. So 85% of the Australian flora is endemic to Australia. So found nowhere else in the world. So if 85% of our flora is endemic, there's going to be a high percentage of our vegetation types that only occur in Australia. So I mean, we've got, if we talk about legislation and the EPBC Act and threatened ecological communities, we've only got one listed in the NT, and that's the Arnhem Plateau, the shrubland complex. We potentially should have more, but it's quite a bit of a process to have those ecological communities listed. I know there's quite a few listed in New South Wales and the southern jurisdictions where, you know, that the landscape's just highly degraded and cleared, whereas in Northern Australia, we're actually quite fortunate up here that, you know, our landscapes are still quite intact compared to, well, they've been highly modified, but quite intact compared to, you know, the southern jurisdictions. So if we place our vegetation into an international context, I just think it gives a little bit more weight to the protection of our vegetation types.
This is a basic question. Is there any ideal or standard plot size most commonly used? Because there are a lot of different legacy you said. Just to curiosity to know.
It's a very good question. So up here in Northern Australia, well, the top end of the Northern Territory, we use a standard plot size of 20 by 20 metres. And that's used basically for characterising what the vegetation is. So part of our methodology is to do a basal sweep as well. So that's a plotless method where it picks up stems outside the plot. So that helps determine what are the dominant species as well. In the arid zone, because the vegetation's more sparse, the plot sizes will be larger. So I know when we did a big survey in the Tanami, which if you look at that map, there's hardly any sites, but we did a lot of sites in the Tanami, we were using 30 by 30 metre plots because we felt that was a big enough size to pick up the floristic and the structural composition to be able to classify that sort of vegetation type. If it's for if it's monitoring, it depends on the purpose of the survey too. If it's mapping, your plot size might be smaller, but if it's for monitoring, like the TERN ecosystems, the odds plots, they're 100 by 100 metres. I know that there's other plot sizes where they've used 50 by 50. There's plot sizes, so in riparian areas where you might do a 10 by 30. So yeah, it's highly dependent on the survey purpose and the complexity of the vegetation. Rainforest surveys, for example, I know when Jeremy did the rainforest survey up here in the 1990s, I don't think he was looking at structure so much. It was just, I don't think he had a plot size. I think he walked around in that homogeneous patch and came up with a floristic list.
Just follow up with that, isn't it? Remembering my experience in this case, isn't it that we determine that plot size doing some initial, pilot surveys where the saturation comes. So you keep on increasing, like if it's 10 meter by 10 meter, then 20 by 20. When the number of species become stable, then you determine depending on the community. So then it could be 50 meter by 50 meter in Tanami. It could be, yeah.
Yes,
so
exactly.
It will depend on that.
Absolutely, yep.
Yeah. So my question, not my question, but comment was regarding TERN. And so it's looking so exciting, the last map that you put on. So you got ecosystem surveillance, you got landscape, as well as that flux thing. One thing that I thought is missing is if we include people's perspective, which will be like ecosystem services on the top of that, then whatever TERN does, then it connects really well with why these processes and functionings are important for the economies. So it can have a lot bigger impact. Look, that's the background I come from anyway. That's what I'm thinking.
There is some great TERN presentations. So I was going through some of they had a short presentation, a medium one, a long one, and they had so many great slides in there that answered some of those questions, and how their data is applied in the real world and why it's useful. So Ben will probably deliver one of those. He might even touch on it at ESA as well. So
because it would be nice to have that kind of perspective attached to this. If we know that these are the services delivered from the functioning of this landscape, then we know what type of economies are supported, because this is the foundation. None of the other economies will work if this doesn't exist.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And we miss that big link, and it's quite often a big mistake.
Yes, huge mistake. Yeah.
Thank you. Donna, years ago in the 2000s, early 2000s, there was a project by the Tropical Savannas Cooperative Research Centre to try and develop or reconcile the different vegetation mapping systems across the savannas from WA, NT and Queensland. I was just wondering, is that still useful, or those maps were sort of all around everywhere at that time.
That
But
one, yeah, absolutely. So that is still around and used, yeah, for sure. And there's been a couple of attempts across Northern Australia. So there was the one by Fox.
That's the one Penny's talking about.
That is the one you're talking about. Yes, okay. I thought it might have been. Funny, it's interesting that you bring this up, because another project that I'm really keen to get up, and I know the botanical community is really keen to get it up too, but we don't have a flora of the Northern Territory. Like when it comes to being able to identify what the plants are, we don't have a complete flora like Victoria does or New South Wales does. Like we've got the Flora NT website, but you can't go in and just key something out. You can go to a key to species, which is on key. This is another presentation I should do, by the way. And I will, because I think it's really important so that people know what identification resources are out there. But something we worked on about 10 years ago with CHAR, so the Council Heads of Australasian Herbaria, was to come up with a savanna key using that map as the study area. So what we did was use that boundary, that mapping boundary of the savannas, to clip it to all the Australasian virtual herbarium records. So then we had a checklist for the flora of tropical savannas, because we need something like that up here. People are like, how do I identify what? Wow, where do I go to identify this? You know, it might just be something really common, and Brock doesn't cover everything. So we put a business case together, and we're hoping to get some funding through BHP at the time. And there was a bit of a downturn, and it didn't get up in the end. And then I thought, oh, maybe we can get some NEST funding with that round. So we had a meeting February 2019, and the ALA director came up here. Some of the CHAR representatives came up, and so we hosted it out at Palmerston to talk about, you know, this savanna key again and what we could do differently. And we said, well, we need a web presence to begin with. We can use existing keys. So there's Euclid, which covers all the eucalypts. There's Wattle that covers all the acacias, and we just clip it to that savanna region boundary. So I'd still like to develop partnerships to make this happen, because there's a huge need for it. And herbaria right across Australasia are so under-resourced and are really finding it hard. I mean, they're the southern jurisdictions too. When we talk about Northern Australia, we've got ATH, so the Australian Tropical Herbarium, which is a partnership with JCU, Queensland Government, CSIRO, and then we've got the NT Herbarium, which it'd be great if we had that same partnership happening with the NT Herbarium, the CDU. So anyway, food for thought there, because we really do need a product like that.
Glad you mentioned the map.
Yes.
I was going to mention it as well.
Oh, yes. So it is used.
It's one of the best products that came out of the Savannah CRC, I reckon, was that map, where it dealt with those just jurisdictional differences. Each state has its own unique classification system, and their goal was to break that down, because we've got a biome that spans 3 huge states, a quarter of Australia. So.
Yeah, it is a quarter of Australia.
For someone like myself who works a bit on this sort of modelling landscapes, it's a perfect scale. It's about 1 to 2 million. That's 40 or 50 broad vegetation groups, about 150 units. And so we might be insensibly understanding processes in one of these units. It's the perfect vehicle to sort of spatially extrapolate.
So that was our go-to. That was our go-to map, saying, okay, we need to click this. What's our boundary if we were to develop a savanna key for the Northern Australian flora?
Yep, I don't know, it's not easily available now, but it's a Queensland Herbarium product.
Yes,
they led the project.
Ian Fox,
Ian Fox is still ticking, don't worry about it. I've got a copy.
framed and put it up.
I've actually got the digital shape file if anyone wants it, and it's a really useful product, I find. Yeah. And it's biome, it's about a biome. No one cares what state you're in. It's across the entire tropical savanna. It's clipped at about 550 millimetres rainfall, and to be honest, savanna, but it's more than savannas. I mean, it's got rainforest.
Rainforest as
It's
well.
got wetland systems classified in there as well.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Thanks.
Comments?
Just to follow on from that, that was made in the first decade of the 2000s. Yeah, 2001.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it just sort of illustrates how long it takes to do things, and how, you know, often there's good work done. It's not immediately apparent how it might be used. So yeah, that's great to hear. Just thought I'd mention that because there's.
The old stuff's still very.
Yeah, that's right, Linz. Yeah.
Actually, while we're talking about mapping, with NVIS, when I talk about the National Vegetation Information System, so that classification system was developed for mapping data sets. So they wanted to come up with a seamless vegetation map of Australia. So when they started this process back in, that was all done back in the early 2000s as well, because the attribute manual 2000 was ESCV, the Executive Steering Committee for Vegetation Information. That was in 2003. And so they needed to come up with a classification system to be able to bring these spatial data sets together. So when they first compiled it, it was like a patchwork quilt. So different spatial scales, different levels of attribute detail from different jurisdictions. So having that one classification system, so everyone might be familiar with the major vegetation types, the major vegetation subtypes, that's an NVIS product. And they are continuously revising it. So if the jurisdictions have new mapping data sets, they provide them to NVIS, but it needs to be within that NVIS sort of classification. So it's all standardised attribution. We're all talking about the same thing. So yes, those state and territory boundaries, you could see the lines on the map when they first did it. Yeah, I've probably got a good image of it. I've got an old presentation of that actually that Richard Thackway provided back in 2007 when we did the workshops and seminars. I think you attended those. Yeah. Oh gosh, that's 14 years ago.
It's only yesterday.
I know, that's right.
Donna,
yes.
Oh, sorry. I've got another question, and I saw some photos of you in there with newspapers and pressing and all that kind of thing. That, you know, really exciting. You know, sort of. That's old school as well. And I was going to ask a question. Are you as traumatised as I am by the change in the format of the NT News?
Oh, well, herbarium specimens don't fit.
It's useless for herbarium pressing now. Yeah.
Absolutely. What do you use now?
I've kept old ones. And they're worth gold. I'm thinking of selling them on, you know, some high value, the dark web.
Oh, here we go. I'll leave that chat there. So, is that the photo there that you were?
Yes, and I thought, I wonder if they're old ones or the new ones.
Oh, these ones. Okay.
Yeah.
This was this year.
Okay.
This was a Groot. So this was a Bush Blitz expedition. Has everyone heard of Bush Blitz?
Yeah.
It was fantastic. It was such a good expedition. So that was back in June, actually. So I finished the report and then I started with TERN. But we still press our specimens like this. We collect genetic samples now with our herbarium specimens, and yeah, we still carry our, you know, our presses. Yeah, so I mean, those old drying ovens, you know, they've been around for a long time. Yeah, and they still work.
Anyone got any other pressing questions?
Pressing questions. It was a good joke. I like it.
Doesn't get any better than that. Well, we might wrap up. As you can all see, I hope what Donna brings to the table. Wonderful experience of going bush in the NT, but with a very clear idea of what she's doing in the bush. So please join me in thanking her for a great talk today. Thanks very much, Donna.